So I think Speedy and HTTP2 do fundamentally change. While at the core they're better.
Describe them a little bit. I'm not sure if everyone.
Yeah, for sure. So I was actually just going there. So at the core, Speedy and HTTP2 are better than HTTP in various ways. Probably the most notable ones are, or the most important one is multiplexing. So it's the fact that in Speedy and with the future HTTP2, instead of opening a connection and sending a single request and getting the response back, this would be a message-driven protocol, which is a request and a response. In Speedy, you can just open a connection and send 100 different requests and specify the priorities so you can get the data as soon as it's available. And also, that data can then come in bits and pieces. You can get different portions. And HTTP2 follows the same way. So that's probably, that's just one, but maybe, possibly the most important characteristic of Speedy and the future HTTP2. And that has some pretty substantial implications of how we should build websites. The easiest analogy or the most obvious pattern that it might break is domain charting. So in HTTP, in regular HTTP, because when we want to download multiple resources in parallel, one technique to do that is to break up that content across multiple domains. The browsers, pretty much all browsers today, or literally all browsers today, have 6 to 8 connection limit per domain. So if you want to download 12 or 18 different resources in parallel, one way to do it is to split up your content across domains. There are some pros and cons to domain charting, but what's definitely the case is that in the Speedy world, domain charting is harmful. In the Speedy world, you can open a single connection to a single domain and make those 18 or 100 different requests in parallel. And by adding those different domains, doing domain charting, all you're really doing is adding DNS lookups, adding connection openings, and just adding overhead on the device. So that's one example of the cases of a case where Speedy should change the patterns that we work with. But it's not the only one. Maybe I'll mention one more that it's notable, which is in the world of Speedy, because of the connections and because of some better compression and header compression and just sort of better utilization of the connection that Speedy offers, the cost of a request is not as substantial. So I mentioned domain charting about splitting the content, but there are a whole world of other optimizations that we do today around consolidating resources together, spriting images together, all meant to alleviate the request, to try and make fewer requests so there'll be fewer round trips. That is not necessary to a large extent in Speedy, and sometimes even harmful. So that's another area where we may find ourselves doing something that we may find ourselves in a situation where the Speedy case would prefer one website where the non-Speedy case would be another. So I guess going back to the core question about how should it adapt our preferences, I think the protocols are different, and yes, if you look 5 years down the road, we should have different best practices than what we have now. I think the primary challenge would be in the transition period. It would be in the stretch of time during which your website would get 20% of its clients coming that support Speedy and 80% not. So should you optimize for one versus optimize for the other? And as that ratchet grows. Once we get to the point where it doesn't matter, when the clients that don't support the newer protocols are such a meager amount that they don't matter anymore, I think we'll just have better or different best practices, and that'll be fine. It's really the few years that we're going to be in transition that will be the problem. Yeah, just dominating a little bit I guess, with this question. So I talk a lot about situational performance. I think Speedy is a very explicit example of it, but this is also true around the website that is optimal for a weak mobile device versus a powerful desktop, for a poor network condition versus a fiber connection at home. So I think in general we should think about performance as something that is situational, and for every incoming request try to understand the current context, the current situation, what are the client properties, whether it's device or software, what are the network properties at the moment, what are the protocols being supported, and try to make the best decision possible at the moment. So that means our routing, our delivery vehicles need to be smarter. I'm in Akamai. I know we do a lot of that at Akamai. Oftentimes that has to do also at the origin on your servers there. You need to think a little bit different, think about more of a rules-driven delivery than just URL-driven. Oftentimes you would return different content to the same URL. So we need to embrace that concept of situational performance, of different situations required different conditions, and that would set us up well for the future.
Actually, I think an alternate look at it from sort of the implementation from the front end for folks who aren't working in such an exceptional enterprise environment from day-to-day stuff. I think one of the hallmarks of the success of HTTP2 and Speedy will be that technically we shouldn't have to alter what we're doing too much to make it work well in our situations. I think that we should always assume the worst of the network, and that if we think that we're going to be able to get lazy and stop being careful, that is not the ideal way to look at it. I think the domain sharding thing is an interesting thing, but requests, we should always look to reduce requests where we can and be efficient where we can, because it's going to be a long time or never before network is free and immediate.
I do want to point out one thing that I didn't mention, which is I think the difference between the best practices that we would need with and without Speedy is big enough that my well-publicized perspective is that right now, when you turn on Speedy on a website that is optimized for HTTP, you would often get very little, if any, acceleration. I mean, for the websites like the Googles that are already optimized to the T and would also tune themselves further for Speedy, they can get really substantial benefits. But in the studies that I've run, in many studies that I've seen from various others, in my conversations, because Akamai does offer Speedy and we turn that on, oftentimes the benefit from Speedy is nowhere near where its full potential is, and it's because of the plethora of domains on the resources. It's because of these resource consolidations. So I do think that we need to think about this seriously as Speedy. Just now in the latest Apple event, Apple said they will support Speedy, so that's exciting news for that world. And I think we need to kind of give more attention into the best practices in a Speedy-enabled world.
What are the significant differences in terms of performance expectations from mobile users versus desktop users? Are there any?
I can speak to this a little bit. Actually, it's funny. There's a lot of, or shouldn't say a lot. Occasionally, more than occasionally, I encounter people who think that because we know that pages are slower on mobile devices, that therefore users have gotten accustomed to the idea that pages are going to be slower and that they're comfortable with that. And so a lot of the research that I've been doing over the past 8 months has been about actually responding to that and finding out, is that actually the case? It's sort of pinned on, there are a few surveys, mobile user surveys, that go back to 2011, 2012, where it was kind of surprising. We found that actually 85% of users say that they actually expect mobile pages to be faster on their mobile devices than they do on the desktop. And people also, about half of those people expect pages to load in 4 seconds or less on their mobile device, whatever, regardless of what type of device it is. So that was really interesting. But I'm a little bit suspicious of survey-based research, because what people say they want versus what they'll actually tolerate or accept can be hugely different. So without giving too much away, I'm going to be presenting some research tomorrow where I go into that in a little more detail, where we actually took people into a lab and actually put EEG headsets on them and served them mobile experiences over different speeds, and actually kind of baselined it, and then served them different paced user experiences. And we did find there was a significant measurable difference between how between levels of frustration and user engagement. So I don't want to say it much more than that. So you have to go into my talk tomorrow. All right after lunch tomorrow.
Yeah. My question is actually not so. That's interesting to know. But my question was not so much around user expectations, but I was thinking more in terms of the patterns of usage for applications and scenarios. For example, the input mechanisms on mobile, and the kind of apps people use on mobile versus the desktop. Are there like different places you optimize in mobile versus desktop? Do you think about perf differently? Not so much about like whether perf is important on mobile or not, but more about do you focus on like different aspects when you're optimizing mobile applications versus desktop?
So I think historically we've thought that mobile users are browsing or mobile users are on the go and they don't have intention to do whatever the primary action of the page is. But I think that while that may have been true in the past, it's probably changing now, and people are more often trying to accomplish very intense, heavy things on mobile devices as they would on desktop, and they're expecting it to really behave as their desktop pages do. So while maybe in the past we could say that optimizing your browsing experience first, or optimize on-the-go user experiences first, now it's much more important to really optimize the entire experience because mobile devices are becoming the primary devices for many users. We found there was a great study here a couple of years ago that was shared that globally, mobile devices are the primary internet access method, especially for people in lower socioeconomic regions. And so we really need to consider that people are using these devices not just casually, but really in everyday situations. So yeah, I wouldn't say we should optimize for performance in particular situations.
Yeah, I think that anytime you go that route, you're doing a bit of mind reading. And I'm not a good statistics person, but the number of people even in the US for whom their mobile device is the only way they access the web is higher than you would really think. So these are people who are applying for jobs using their phone and doing things that historically, if we try to read their minds and think, gosh, what would a person do on a mobile phone? We'd be like, oh, they would just go use a desktop for that. But because we can't make those assumptions, you kind of have to optimize everywhere. And optimization in this case is often not necessarily a nuts and bolts thing about numbers, but often about the experience and making, for example, those form fields on that job application in any way usable on a phone with a soft keyboard. So optimization becomes a multi-spectrumed thing that gets really complicated. And basically, the short answer is you have to optimize the hell out of everything for everyone all the time.
And to add to that, I think that perceived performance is really what we're talking about here. We found that reducing scrolling jank, right? So sluggishness on scrolling was a huge improvement for our users. Or if the primary action is searching, make sure that that's accessible and immediately interactive upon load. So those are the kinds of things you may want to focus on as you're building out performance for a mobile experience.
We'll say that on the more technical level, there is a difference between the mobile devices and the desktop devices. So there are things that you need to optimize more for mobile because you can't take them for granted, as you might do. And just earlier today, Pat Meenan was talking about web page test and showing the timelines. And that study, and various studies that I've seen recently, I haven't actually run one of those myself, show that on a mobile device, oftentimes 30, sometimes as much as 50% of the time is spent computing on the device. This is above and beyond the fact that the mobile device is more likely to be on a crappy cellular network. But this is just sort of the compute on the device itself of, this is not some sort of mobile game. This is just browsing websites, and it's about processing the 200 kilobytes of a JavaScript library that you have. And those are things that you're rightfully dismissive of when you think about desktops. Like in desktops, even in a very low-powered desktop, those times often don't count for anything. Sometimes scrolling is the same way. On the desktop device, beyond the fact that you scroll with a finger versus the mouse, it's just performance is that much faster, the GPUs are better, everything is better, so scrolling is smooth. On a mobile device, suddenly you need to think about that, otherwise you'll get janked. So I think to a certain extent, mobile is a higher bar because you now need to optimize for less compute, worse networks, and you still need to optimize for all these different activities. So I think to a certain extent, you do need to optimize for everything. You need to think about mobile differently, more in the sense that you need to lose some of the assumptions that you may have done just 3, 4, 5 years ago around the resources available at your disposal.
Right. Yeah, and I don't mean to dismiss that at all. The guy is totally right. And if you do, there are like some top hit things you can do if you are serving to an audience that has a high proportion of mobile users. There's sort of the basic stuff that they always drill into you about, minimizing your requests, minimizing your performance intensive JavaScript and CSS, things that have to render or perform on the device because that commodity hardware just doesn't really cut it in a lot of cases. And I think that what Guy said about the high bar, I guess I almost take it for granted in my day-to-day work now that is the bar. Like I assume pretty much the worst, and I kind of go from there.
So I think you guys summarized it really well. I just wanted to add one more small thing. In a nutshell, I think we've already discussed this here. But when we talk about mobile, we want to make sure that we are limiting the data that we are sending to the device. You guys did mention that. We want to make sure that the CPU, it's not a very CPU intensive operation because it's going to suck up the memory and people will start complaining about it. A good example was that this application called Waze. It's a very good navigation based application, but if you turn that on 30 minutes, your iPhone the battery life would go from 100 to 0 in 30 minutes. So the first thing I did was, it's a great app, but I do not need this app. So that is another aspect that we have to understand. And the other piece, I think, is the rendering and all that stuff. Especially when we talk about mobile, there's also, we have to make sure we have to account for different bandwidths and different speeds, depending on what kind of a connectivity we have. That can also have a severe impact to the mobile.
Yep. So I think all of those that's very right. You need to account for battery life as well. You need to account for those requests. At the end of the day, if you're here on the Wi-Fi and you've got your laptops on and everybody's using the Wi-Fi and your Wi-Fi is really slow, you'd appreciate those things on the desktop as well. The bar is just higher on the desktop. I think there's an interesting notion as well when you talk about mobile, going beyond the mobile devices and thinking about the Internet of Things. I had a very interesting conversation with Josh Clark talking about how, to a certain extent, even on a mobile device, we're still approaching things behind a screen, and we are somewhat conditioned to accept, even if we're our tolerance is lower and lower, a certain amount of delay. This is all virtual we're doing. But once we start interacting with digital devices in the world, once they start becoming they're trying to be an illusion of reality, they're trying to be an illusion of something that's part of our physical world, or even electricity, then suddenly the tolerance goes even lower. Right? When you flip a light switch, you expect the light to go on right away. You don't care that it's traversing the web all the way out to a data center in Albuquerque or whatever it is and coming back just to light your light bulb. If it's not immediate, then it's not working well. So
just wanted to add just a little personal anecdote. Because it's not just about how fast the pages load as well. I was riding the Caltrain yesterday, and I had an awesome 3G connection. I don't even know, it was magical. It was just everything was coming to my phone like grease lightning. And I was loving it, and then realized that I had blown through 20 megs of data in 12 minutes. I'm not going to name which sites they were, but they're sites that probably most of us use on a regular basis, and they were the mobile versions of the site. So this was the best that these site owners were able to deliver. And 20 megs of data. I mean, I had a little heart attack, and then I remembered that I had a really, really big data plan for this particular trip. So I calmed down, but I was sweating for a second because I don't know where I'm Canadian. We pay a lot for our data; it's not cheap. So just bear in mind, you people are out there on the go, and you don't know what kind of plan they're operating with, and it's kind of I think of it as almost a moral imperative to make sure that you're making sure that every single one of those people isn't just having a fast experience, but they're also having an efficient experience and across a lot of different metrics.
I think it's very easy for us as developers to forget that the really shiny new hardware we have in our pockets and these amazing connections that we're experiencing is not what our users are probably experiencing. Especially working with developers at Etsy, who are developing these new features on their laptops on a wired connection. They forget that they're not our end users. So it's important for us to remember that we have to accommodate for all these things.
You don't need to go that far. I mean, I just moved to London, UK, a couple of weeks ago. And you would think London would be fairly well connected, but London also has trains that go under things and around things and that go the distance. And I don't recall in Canada, where I was at 2 weeks ago, experiencing GPRS and Edge and those types of protocols as much as I did in the last couple of weeks. And it's frustrating. It's even the office versus the drive back is a concern. We almost need a certain regiment for training new developers to force them, give them a crappy little phone that they need to live with for 30 days, and require that they go underground to their home back.
So we've joked at Etsy that we're gonna throttle the network internally for our developers for a week and see how much pain they're in and see what they fix based on it. Because we want them to feel the pain of our users, and we want them to understand what their stuff is actually like after they develop it. So I don't know whether we're actually going to do it.
Awesome idea.
But I think we might. So we did that for mobile web templates
too.
Do
it randomly. So.
They won't even know.
All too often, performance and capacity are ignorantly interchanged. And so this is sort of a performance as well as capacity question. It's my hypothesis that the more mobile users that you get actually really affect capacity because of the way mobile devices interact with the network. And so, what are some of the experiences that, do you have to, for every 10% more, you have to increase your capacity by X, or have you found that, well, it doesn't really matter?
Capacity of what? I'm actually not totally sure.
Like cellular network.
I mean, if you have 10 web servers in a web server farm, you plan for 4x or 3x, and now you brought on.
I think I guess from the looks, it looks like I'm at. So I think there are two interpretations maybe to the term of capacity. One is just sheer server-side capacity around managing your servers. I think mobile is spurring on the growth of the web, and with that, the growth of the capacity that you need. But if anything, mobile devices, if you planned your systems right, probably consume less or present less of a load on your systems because as much as we wanted, it's still a small screen. We still should be displaying less content on it. Therefore, if we did it well, sending less requests or getting less data from the servers. So I think on that front, we always need to grow, and I think as mobile devices grow in general, as 4G and easier ways for these mobile devices to consume data come into play, yes, we need to provision more. But I think that, in my opinion, that's just the evolution of the web. The other aspect is the capacity of the cellular networks, which is not something that we have that much control over. And that one is definitely a problem. As far as I know from my conversations with cellular carriers, the primary challenge right now that they face is more about burst capacity. If you look at any given antenna, oftentimes, at best, it's 50% capacity, even over the stretch of a 5 minutes. So even at rush hour, there's these bursts of data. And they're still trying to figure that out. Like, that's not something that has been well maintained. There's a lot of evolution, a lot of advancements in the world of carrier technology, pushing decisions further out, closer to the user, smarter gateways, smarter communications with the devices. 4G itself, which, by the way, what we call 4G is actually not 4G based on the specification, but it doesn't matter. Newer protocols that are faster are moving along all the time. So I think we should expect it to improve and expect it to grow. And at the same time, my guess, and also based on historical evidence, is that it would grow slower than our expectations. So at the end of the day, users would expect things to be faster and faster, more based on their FiOS at home than based on their kind of 4G the connection, like on the cellular connection.
A lot of this conversation talks about mobile and mobile users as if it's a homogenous environment. And I guess I just wanted to hear from some of you about how you're analyzing the heterogeneous long tail of what I perceive as mobile and analytics around that, etc.
I work with Maggie, so I can talk a little bit about what we do at Etsy in terms of long tail. So when I think about the long tail of users and how they relate to how we're developing, we're looking at the majority of users and how that's evolving over time. So I just gave this talk about how to build a device lab, and in that context, we're looking at what are the new devices that are coming out that we should purchase to address those needs and find bugs, etc. But you're right. As it becomes more fragmented, it definitely becomes more difficult to be testing all these different things and accommodating for all of the different screen sizes and bugs and JavaScript issues and all sorts of other things. So I think when it comes to the long tail, we just kind of accepted that we won't always be able to get all of the things and capture all the use cases and test on all the devices. We just have to optimize for the most that we've got.
Yeah. So typically we advise designing along a continuum and developing along a continuum because we can't think of things as discrete sizes or shapes because we're continually proven wrong. And one thing that we do sometimes is when we're testing things on devices, I'll throw automated tests at completely random devices out there and be like, oh, here's this Android that no one bought that has this absolutely absurd resolution and is running Android 2.3. What does its browser give us? Oh, that's our random thing of the day. And sometimes you won't get 100%, but throwing some oddity into the mix is really useful and enlightening. So,
Yeah, we ended up graphing I guess not graphing, representing all the screen sizes that get over 1 million visits per month to Etsy. Like on a spectrum, like we basically photoshopped them all together, and there are no breakpoints anymore. Like it is just a spectrum of screen sizes, so it's impossible to start to pick and choose things because it's going to evolve.
I was just going to add that every year at Radware, we look at the top 100 retail sites, and we test them on a variety of different mobile devices like smartphones and tablets. And the only thing that all of these results have in common is that they're wildly disparate. So we could go from a page that takes like 2 or 3 seconds to load on a tablet, and on the other end of the spectrum, we have certain smartphones where the same page is taking 11, 12, 13 seconds to load. And so for me, the takeaway from that is that you just always think that you're designing for the lowest common denominator, and know that lowest common denominator exists, and that it's not just on the fringes. Like if you look at the mobile using population, I think the number that ComScore came out with recently is that by the end of 2014, 1 out of 4 human beings, so not even differentiating adults, children, 1 out of 4 human beings on the entire planet is going to have a smartphone. That's a significant enough number that doesn't matter what type of phone it is, there's going to be a big chunk of people who are using it. So just, always keep that lowest common denominator in mind.
So I have two small things to add. One is in implementation-wise, I like the approaches that NPR, actually probably most publicly the BBC, are taking of progressive enhancement. So, the BBC has this cuts the mustard test, and basically they deliver a basic experience, not knowing that the device, what is the device, and they progressively enhance to a higher level. And to a certain extent, that almost always carries a certain amount of penalty on the higher-end device because you have some form of additional delay there. But it supports a much broader set of devices. So both the BBC and NPR, for being kind of the national public news organizations in their respective countries, it's more critical in their system to support truly like access to news, access to that information across the system. So they've sort of invested in that, and I like that. So that's one piece of information. The other different one is that oftentimes what you need to do when you look at these devices is looking at the popular devices, but also make sure that you look at your target demographic and not just across the board or what are the generic stats. For instance, in Japan, a mobile website usually starts with an S dot indicating a smartphone because a mobile phone is usually one of those more kind of closed gardens type of networks that they have of the older feature phones. Those feature phones have permeated in that society much more than they have in North America. And there's whole ecosystems of apps and websites and activities that are oriented to those devices. Those devices would probably not even be a blip if, what I'm guessing here, in Etsy's general dashboard of those components. But if you were looking to penetrate Japan especially, then you would probably need to put some pretty real attention there. Same goes for low-cost Android devices if you're looking for an Africa or Asian expansion, etc.
The other comical thing about this too that I think is interesting is like mobile is such a catch-all. We've actually had an internal debate about how we refer to mobile at Etsy. I used to have a dashboard that said like mobile versus desktop, right? And it was like a pie chart. And it was how much of our traffic comes from mobile devices versus desktop devices. And there was this long email thread that happened. And I had to change it to say non-desktop versus desktop. Because we were conflating handsets and tablets and glass or whatever. And we were,
laptop qualify as a desktop?
Well, that was the funny thing. Like, how do you, and like, then there's the Chromebook Pixel. And then there's like huge tablets. And then how does like the Galaxy Note fall in? I guess it's a smartphone, but it's kind of also like a small tablet. I mean, I laugh when we talk about mobile just because, like, what does that really mean these days? And I think that as this whole conversation evolves, we're not going to be talking about, like, mobile anymore because that's going to be the thing. It's going to be everything else.
Pan-device web.
Right, yes.
Yeah, it's a semantic and slightly pedantic argument that I don't like to engage in anymore because it's sort of religious, or you're going to have your own opinion philosophically. I think that just to tie back on one particular thing about progressive enhancement is, when you have the chance to kind of ask the device what it can do, and the sort of cuts the mustard philosophy, don't assume. And I mean, I didn't even mention progressive enhancement a moment ago because I think I assume it, but I want to shout it off the rooftops. Like, that is the way to go. I mean, the HTML and the web at its core is responsive. It's what we do to it that makes it not responsive. So every decision we make is additive and adding risk, and you have to think about everything you're doing and not make assumptions. And I think it's almost like learning to walk again in a way.
And what's
Both
on
of
a
those
t-shirt?
cases. Sorry.
Yeah, what's on a t-shirt? What we do to it makes it not responsive.
It's a nice quote. And I think some of it is the two tied together with the notion of what is mobile and the notion of a mobile-first design. Because I think today a lot of people, pretty much anybody you talk to, they would say, yeah, whatever it is, we designed X, and of course it's mobile-first. But then there's the definition of what mobile, and for them, mobile-first might mean like iPhone-first. Yeah. It wouldn't mean like, the $20, $50 Android. It wouldn't mean a feature phone. It wouldn't mean a Pebble Watch first. Like it would mean, something that they can digest within their scope of something that's still a rich-ish browser.
Yeah, I think there's so many, and just like the mobile device argument, there's so many different variants of mobile first now, right? Like constraints first, content first, minimal first. I like baseline first because you're basically in the project you're analyzing, you're saying, okay, here's the core experience. And you're mostly progressively enhancing up. But in some cases, we end up degrading down for long-tail, underpowered devices in certain cases when it makes sense, technically.
So you talked about the spread of form factors and so forth that you encounter. How much are you relying on frameworks like Apache Cordova or things like that to abstract differences among the devices, and how much are you tailoring your development to deal with individual conditions natively on each device?
So I think that the problem space is a little bit different for Cordova or PhoneGap. We've done quite a bit of work in PhoneGap in the past. It's for hybridized native development using web technologies. And I would say a caveat is that it's a wonderful technology, but it does not eliminate what you have to do the differentiation between platforms, especially if you're designing your own UI fully for whatever you're doing in Cordova. That becomes a whole another level of market research and design research that you need to do to make sure you're not alienating users of those specific platforms who expect certain things in their application environments, right? Because it's not the web space anymore. In the web space, we can kind of invent UI to a certain degree while respecting conventions. But when you're in a Cordova or native space, in any case, you have a whole new set of constraints. And so while you can use tools like Cordova to abstract out your code base across devices or device classes, that it does not remove, unfortunately, quite a bit of work on top of that to make sure you're delivering what your customers need on their different platforms.
I think so to me, an aspect of the question was also around the sort of general categories versus the specific variables maybe that you would tune for. And I think realistically, you always have some thresholds or a small number of categories. You're not going to optimize your images for every single pixel change of a display. That would be crazy. But I think what happens with not doing categorization is that you don't bundle variables together. So you might do one thing because the device is, between 480 pixels wide and 640 pixels wide. And you would do a different thing based on whether the device has a touch screen or not. And you wouldn't just bundle the two together and say it's a smartphone and therefore it falls under this category of device width and this category of features. So you would switch to this feature detection. But it doesn't mean that the granularity of your optimization on a specific variable has to be super low level and extremely tight. It may be that you're okay with different types of touch screens, or it may be that you're okay with a general location versus one with GPS versus Wi-Fi based. You don't need to get overly fancy, but just separating out those variables from these buckets of units. Practically speaking, I think all of us, even us, in every talk that we do, still talk about the mobile website, the smartphone website. As humans, we need some simplification when we do the communication, but when it gets down to actually doing some practical implementation, some piece of code that makes a decision, you're better off relying on the variable that matters at the moment and doing your thresholds just based on that.
So latency is a large concern for mobile, and it can vary wildly between DNS lookup and beginning of TCP and versus keeping alive versus when that gets dropped. Are there any tips on or advice on situations where you're like, oh, we love keeping a heartbeat, or like, wow, that drains the battery?
Fewer requests.
Yeah, fewer requests is basically.
Yeah, basic performance.
Yeah. Well, I think latency is, definitely latency is the killer. Latency, the time it takes to get a bit from the device to the server and back. Massive pain in mobile. I think at the end of the day, it's make fewer requests, so you would make fewer round trips. It's acknowledging that first of all, that the latency is going to be high. It's often in the 3 digits and sometimes high 3 digits on cellular networks, and accept that it is volatile. So don't try to think that the latency that you saw at the beginning of a page load is going to be the same at the end of the page load, let alone anything that is longer streamed than that. And that's probably most evident in adaptive video schemes, where you can see that they have to adapt. They have to actually change, and sometimes on a rather frequent basis. To a certain to a large extent, it's just something we need to absorb. There's a separate item around heartbeat and keeping the connection. So for those who don't know, mobile devices, in order to preserve spectrum and battery, they shut down the radio on the device after a few seconds. Oftentimes there's a half power and then a power off mode. And then if you were browsing the page and you were looking at it for 10 seconds, then you click the link, the radio usually needs to get woken up again, and that might cost you 2 to 5 seconds to get it done before your request even gets sent out. And one trick to keep that alive is to basically just send a little Ajax heartbeat every second to just sort of ping the server and do it. That definitely drains the battery. So to me, there's I don't know if I want to go down that rat hole quite yet, but there's a whole conversation around being a responsible citizen on the web. And on one hand, I think as long as there's no real metric that the user would see, I don't think anybody would really care in their website. Like Etsy is a little bit more like principles oriented, maybe from like a code ethic and the image of the organization. And we here in this room would know, but the users of Etsy wouldn't. And at the end of the day, on these mobile devices, as long as there's no alert or something on the device that tells you this is a battery hog website, then there wouldn't really be any strong motivation for you not to do these types of tricks. And there's arguments to be made for the fact that TCP window sizes or TCP slow start was acknowledged as the way to not melt the web, and God forbid anybody would start sending larger packets of data right away. Who knows what's going to happen? And the first cheaters there were actually the biggest players. They were like the Googles and I think the Microsofts of the world. And today everybody does it. And you know what? There's still a web. We're still around. And to a certain extent, we adapt to the challenges that are ahead of us. So I'm a little bit more existentialist in my view on this. I think if you have a way to make your website fast, make it faster, and try to make sure that you're responsible to the user. If your user is going to have your web page on and open for a long stretch of time, don't keep that heartbeat going forever. But if you want to try and keep it going on for 15 seconds, and that makes your website fast, if the devices care about that, they would put in the prompt or they would figure out a better battery scheme, and you want to put that onus on them. Not everybody shares that view, but that's kind of my perspective on this.
I think a quick tip, just based on the kinds of questions you're asking, is run Don't Walk to Any Talk that Ilya Grigorek from Google gives, because he nails all that stuff beyond belief. Really fascinating stuff.
I was going to mention, Ilya is the one who said basically when it comes to latency for mobile, just assume 2,000 milliseconds. So don't be optimistic and best case scenario-ish. Just assume 2,000 and we'll go from there.
And he does the arithmetic for you.
Yeah, he does that.
And on the same topic, Ilya has this whole thing about the first 14K and delivering the site, or as much as the important bits in the first 14K, which is something we've been experimenting with a little bit. But it's real hard.
It's hard
to figure out what is important to cram into that first 14K. But that's another alternative.
Well, I have to follow this up and just ask, if we're concerned about bandwidth, what about loading key things when the user's idle? If I know they're going to stay on my page and I'm concerned with the slowness, if I'm not abusive and I'm within reasonable citizenship, if that's the right word, why can't I load the simple part of my site in the first 14K if I'm really to bootstrap with Ilya's approach? And then start, with a WebSocket, or I can think of lots of ways to getting the rest of my site and vendors out here that'll help me do it. Is that a reasonable approach?
I think the adjective or actually it's a noun, sorry, citizenship is the important part of what you're asking. So lazy loading, forward-looking loading, absolutely, very smart. And Google especially is doing some just insane things where they deliver a like the CSS that only will be for above the fold, and they know it's above the fold, so they only deliver that to get that to glass as fast as possible. I think that I think it's a kind of a contract with your user, right? Like if you're a website that's like a photo gallery, you don't want to go and preload 100 images ahead of where your user is in. But that again comes back to sort of common sense citizenship. So I mean, and also the continuum often has to do with the resources that you have. Like Google can throw incredible brain power and incredible manpower at this, but if you're a mom and pop company trying to build a website that works well, across devices, but you have one dude working on this or 3 girls or just anyone, any small group of folks, it's not always feasible to do some of this. So I think identifying sort of the biggest bang for buck that you can start with, but if you have the resources to do that and you can do it in a way that respects your users, by all means.
I think that we've talked a lot about opportunity cost here and like the cost of it's operational cost as well. Like when we talk about many of these things, when we tried that at Etsy, they may have like a small performance win, but actually are a huge operational cost for us. And so we will, negate the small performance win because it doesn't make sense for our development environment. So I think that that's totally part of it. And then coming back to this whole thing, I think it's actually all about user experience too. We're talking about battery life. We're talking about perceived performance. We're talking about total page load time. And I think that like when we talk about prefetching or lazy loading, we're still talking about the user experience and what is the best overall experience for our users.
Without costing them too much money.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that I disagree with some of these comments, but I think at the end of the day, there's a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma going on here. Like, I think there's anybody should act in their own best interest, and the world will adjust a little bit. So, and also there's a matter of proportions. So, yes, if you go off and you prefetch and you browse the page and you prefetched 7 additional pages afterwards, clearly you're going to be, you've done something extra, right? Something is excessive for the majority of your users. But there's also a question about, how much is the incremental, barring a photo gallery where you might, download large volumes of data.
Argument.
How much bandwidth really have you used when you've loaded the unique components, extra components of these 7 other pages on a web page, and how much does that compare to like 10 seconds of video that user might watch on YouTube, or like a single load of page of maps when they're calling their Uber. So there's a little bit of a proportion. And once again, there's also the fact that Tammy knows that she just sucked in 20 megabytes by browsing those 10 pages. But you're 1 in a million. Like really, at the end of the day, the majority of users that are browsing it would have absolutely no idea. We've taught users to care about SSL because we've added in like 17 different iterations until eventually we landed on something that we think is good enough. It's probably not. Around telling people that a website is secure. If this becomes enough of an issue, we'll figure out the right icon or color to tell a user that this website is misbehaving.
I think that so the other part of this I think you touched on earlier is like, who is the onus really on? Is it on us? Is it on browser vendors? Is it like I think about progressive JPEGs and how I think that they take more CPU on mobile devices to render each incrementally better version of the JPEG. How slight is that? And should that be on me to worry about? Should that be on browser vendors who are making mobile Safari to worry about? Like, I think that a lot of that is like, who's the onus really on to like optimize for end users?
And I think if it makes your user experience worse, then you would care, and it's entirely your problem to decide what is the right one for you to do. But if it's not, and if it's just the cost of the battery life, and then I don't know, to a certain extent.
I've given entire talks on onus.
On onus?
Yes.
It's like, don't all follow that advice right now, because then the internet would melt. But, in theory.
So we've talked a lot about input and output, getting the file onto the mobile device, and, well, just that direction, actually. But how about once it's on the device? I mean, we talked a teeny bit on battery, but do you guys have any advice on what we should avoid to not drain our user's battery? And also, once, in terms of creating and re-rendering, especially if we're animating or scrolling, are there certain maybe CSS features that we should, like 4 years ago I used to create browsers all the time, but there's a little bit more memory on the device and the browsers are more powerful. So do you guys have any recommendations as to what to avoid?
Yeah, CSS animations. But I mean, I could go on all day. But a basic technique that people use to make them more performant is to make sure you're involving the z-axis, which you may already know, probably. But I find the fastest way to drain a battery and piss off a device is to have like a looping CSS animation or very complex CSS transitions. Anything that's causing a repaint of the whole browser, you can benchmark that. It's kind of fascinating, actually. So I think it's sort of common sense stuff in that realm, but I definitely, that's the first place I look before I look at, and then I go and look at JavaScript execution and blocking in that way.
So you actually first looked at animation before CSS?
Yeah, I've done some analysis of some beautiful CSS animation that I had to ditch because it would, you could feel the device like heating up. And I started analyzing it and looking at repaints and frame rates and all the stuff you're supposed to do, and I had to realistically at the end of the day say can't ship this on mobile. It's too harsh and cruel.
Yeah, I've got any thoughts about long polling versus websites, thinking about battery latency and performance. So if you've got a live print on the page.
But long polling.
Yeah, long polling versus WebSockets in terms of the performance of the battery and the actual page. I've got any thoughts which would be more appropriate?
We'll use speedy server push. Yeah, I think so. I think between long polling and WebSockets, I guess. So for those who don't know, long polling, the notion of opening a connection, sending a request, and then the server doesn't actually respond right away. So when the server does eventually respond, it's kind of it's a form of push, and you can find out about that at the time. With WebSockets being a binary socket that you actually open up. I guess my advice would be that that's, I don't know if the performance characteristics are that dramatic as far as I know. I think it's more about the type of data that you have. So I guess off the top of my head, I'd say definitely if you need like binary data, then WebSockets might be valuable. The primary challenge is that it wouldn't work in all contexts. And also if you think you're going to be opening 12 of these channels now that you want to get data on, then you're better off doing something smarter on a WebSocket as opposed to hogging 12 connections open to a server. If you're talking about something simpler, if you're just trying to get a game score or something like that, or just the next chat message coming in and not polling suffices, then that might be fine. As much as you can, I would, joking aside, say I think at this point Speedy is quite prevalent, and if you just made sure that your site is on HTTPS and on a Speedy-enabled platform, you may be able to use server push. I mean, the whole industry is kind of looking for good opportunities to use server push, and this is one of the only ones that is well acknowledged that is one.